with the new Nvidia 3000 series GPUs coming out, the 3070, 3080, and 3090, should you get the Nvidia Founders Edition directly from Nvidia, or should you get one of the third-party partner cards that are going to have different coolers on it? Let's discuss what I think you should do, some of the differences. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and leave a comment below with your choice. Let's get started. Let's get right into it. The Nvidia GPUs coming out now, the 3000 series, basically Nvidia sells their own version that they call the Founders Edition, and then that's going to be paired up with third-party partner cards that often are going to have their own coolers. Nvidia basically just gives them the PCB and the base GPU design, and they could slap on whatever cooler that they want from a company like, Asus, EVGA, MSI, etc. There's a bunch of them that do it. So here's the question that we're going to try to answer today. Should you get the Founders Edition card from Nvidia, or should you get one of these other third-party cards? What are going to be the main differences? First, let's talk about the history of the last two generations. So with the 10 series, Nvidia had these Founders Edition cards, and the important thing to note here, with something like a 1080 Ti, they had a blower style cooler. That means that all of the hot air exited out of the back, as opposed to a GPU from a third-party vendor like Asus that's going to have 2 or 3 fans on it, and basically it's going to be a lot more efficient. It's going to throw all that air in the case. So the problem here is the Founders Edition of the 10th series generation, basically what you call Pascal, they really weren't that efficient. It was loud. I remember the 1080 Ti would get up to something like 84 Celsius, which is, pretty warm for a GPU. That's why most of the time we ended up taking off that original Nvidia cooler and just throwing like a water block on it or something like that. So that series of blower style Founders Edition coolers really weren't that great, and that's where people started saying definitely buy the third-party cards. Cooling is a lot better. These cards generally are going to get better performance because they're not going to be hitting these thermal limits. They're nowhere near as noisy and loud. So that started around that generation, and I think Nvidia listened, and definitely by the last generation, the 20 series, like the 2080 Ti, the 2080, they developed a much better cooler than the blower style coolers were than the previous generation 10 series. Now this one was a lot more similar to the third-party cards on the market, but in a lot of cases even this 20 series cooler wasn't necessarily all that perfect. A lot of these third-party GPU coolers from Turing, the 20 series generation, still were a fair bit better than the actual Nvidia Founders Edition, even though we must commend them on improving on that blower style GPU, which is really only good if you're doing a small form factor build where you have not too much room in there, or if you want to stack multiple GPUs. Then blowing that out of the case is a much better idea, because then you have a much smaller environment to work with. But aside from that, generally having fans on your GPU is going to be the superior method of cooling. So knowing that in terms of the history, that's why a lot of Nvidia Founders Edition cards, people didn't really like them too much, even though, and I'll say from personal experience, the build quality is absolutely exceptional on the Founders Edition cards. Even the 1080 Ti and all the 2080, 2080 Ti, 2060, all the way down the line, the build quality just feels absolutely amazing. When you actually physically touch the card, everything feels like very heavy duty. It feels extremely well designed. All the components, you can see they took a lot of care in finishing each component, as opposed to a lot of third-party GPUs, which oftentimes don't have anywhere near the build quality of something like the Founders Edition. So now, knowing this history, how does this translate into the current 3000 series Founders Edition? Let's look at it first from the standpoint of build quality. Now, judging from the very unique design, as well as reading and watching reports of how substantial they feel, how heavy, from the people that have already gotten their hands on them, we can definitely already start to assume that the trend of having really great build quality, Nvidia has kept that consistent through the generations. So that's going to be a big plus versus these third-party GPU coolers. The build quality feels really exceptional, and with that, I think physically the cards probably just last longer than some of these third-party cards. And now, how can we assume this with the 3000 series? Well, a lot of these coolers on the third-party cards, we're starting to see little sneak peeks of them. They look more or less very similar to the 20 series. There are differences in design here and there, but for the most part, they look pretty similar. And my experience with the 10 and 20 series third-party coolers, while often, yes, they have have great performance. The build quality, definitely a lot more plastic going on there, a lot easier to break something off if you drop it, as opposed to these Founders Editions, which seem to be built a lot more solidly. And let's talk about another solid point, and that's going to be price. Since Nvidia actually makes these GPUs, since Nvidia controls the entire GPU process, they can price them probably a lot lower than like a third-party vendor can price them, just because they have access to everything. It's a lot easier for them. So in general, you're going to find these Founders Editions GPUs at their MSRP are going to be priced lower than most of the competing third-party cards. For example, if the 3070 is $499 or the 3080 is $699, we've already seen in some places like Best Buy the 3080 third party pop up for something like $750 instead of $699, while the Founders Edition still continues to be $699. I think for the price, Nvidia will have most of these third party cards beat. And if you take into account all the work that Nvidia obviously put in designing this cooler and this Founders Edition GPU, I think that ends up actually being a pretty good deal. All the third-party cards, for the most part, it's going to be stuff we have seen already in the 10 and 20 series GPUs, but this Nvidia cooler is truly unique. It has a nice like pass-through design. The way the PCB is designed, everything is really, really awesome about it. It's extremely unique. Of course, we're going to have to wait and see the actual thermal performance and the benchmarks and the numbers before we get a full and complete opinion. But at least judging from the apparent effort that Nvidia put into these coolers and knowing that they can produce something that's higher quality as they've done before historically, probably keep the price a little bit cheaper just because they're the ones making it, that's another factor that sways me towards the Nvidia Founders Edition a little more than something like a third-party card. Let's mention some points as well why you would get a third-party card. Now, there's some very unique third-party cards, something like the EVGA Kingpin, even some of the Asus cards, the higher-end cards. If you're going for something that level, that definitely is unique enough, and you know they're generally built really well, can easily compare to something like the Founders Edition. We don't know exactly what the thermal performance is going to be like on the Founders Edition GPUs yet, but judging by the similar coolers on the third-party GPUs as they were in the 20 series, we know that they're definitely going to be fairly quiet, have pretty good cooling, especially the higher-end cards. All that we really know from these Nvidia coolers is that according to an Nvidia engineer on Reddit, they did say that these Nvidia GPUs are definitely much quieter than previous generations, so that definitely goes a step in the right direction. But we know already that most of these third-party coolers, that's usually been their big appeal. They just perform cooler, and they're going to be quieter as well than a traditional Founders Edition, as well as have some unique elements to them, some unique GPUs, unique designs. Not all of them look exactly like the previous generations, so we'll definitely have to keep an eye on that as well. And also, you do have to remember that if you want RGB, in general, the third-party cards just do it a lot better. Historically, they've had a lot better RGB support. The Founders Edition GPUs, they've generally been a little bit more bland. You'll see, basically, you'll have maybe just a name light up or something like that in a singular color. Last generation, you couldn't really even change it. You're kind of stuck with that. We'll see if this new Founders Edition from Nvidia will open up any possibilities for RGB, but there isn't too much on it as compared to something like an Asus Strix or even a card from EVGA that definitely have a lot more RGB. And I know RGB can be a little bit of a touchy subject. Some people really don't like it. They want their computer to look as simple as possible, but a lot of people, gamers and everybody, definitely like something that has a really intricate, high quality lighting. Even if you put it just in one color, let's say if you put everything to white or purple or something like that, it can often look really, really cool. It's nice having that flexibility. And in general, these third-party GPUs, even if the Nvidia Founders Edition has a little light or a little RGB, in general, the third-party cards are going to have a much more expansive array of RGB lights in different places on the fans. So that's definitely an area that, if it's important to you, say if you have a lot of components already from Asus or EVGA in your system, you want all the RGB to match up, that's when maybe a third-party card, if everything else is equal in terms of performance and your budget, that's when RGB can make a little bit of a difference. For some people, it's very important, and I definitely don't blame them. I love doing water-cooled builds with RGB. I think the lighting adds a tremendous value to these type of builds. After all, in my opinion, computers aren't just meant for like boring work. They're really works of art as well, depending on how you design them, especially if you do a beautiful water-cooled setup. I think they're basically works of art, and really nice lighting can definitely add to that as well. And now, here's a big reason to get a third-party card instead of Nvidia's Founders Edition. That's going to be availability. Now, we know that Nvidia is launching their GPUs, but basically, the Nvidia Founders Edition, you can really only get either from Nvidia or very small other places in the beginning. Sometimes like Best Buy will have them, certain stores will, but there's no doubt that third-party GPUs, you're going to be able to find a lot more of them in a lot different places, online or Newegg, Amazon, Micro Center. You're going to be able to find them in a vast array of places, while the Nvidia Founders Edition, generally it's not sold in as many places, and there's a good chance that they're going to be sold out, especially with the demand that we're seeing with the 3070 and 3080. They'll definitely be sold out pretty quickly, so we don't know how much stock Nvidia actually has on these Founders Edition, especially considering they're generally going to be a little bit cheaper than the third-party cards. Not to mention, like I said before, the build quality, in my opinion, has been exceptional on Founders Edition cards. So having those factors at play, I think they're going to sell out pretty quick, and then you're kind of left with whatever's on the market. And I think the third-party cards are going to be a lot more prevalent everywhere that you look, online and different stores. So that's going to be a factor as well. And then some other comparisons between the Founders Edition and third-party cards. Now, in terms of water cooling, from what we've seen so far of the unboxings and people who have spoken about maybe tearing them down, they seem to have like fairly difficult access. Now, it looks like these GPUs are a lot harder to take apart, similar to what maybe like an Apple product may be. I don't know if these are going to be the best GPUs to water cool, to put a water block on. Now, of course, third-party GPUs are generally going to be a lot easier. Some companies even already sell the GPU with a water block. And now this is really concerning the initial launch of the GPUs available now. They may be releasing later on third-party GPUs that have more VRAM and different things like that may have actually more performance than the ones being released now. So that would be definitely something that would skew the Founders Edition versus third-party even more. But as it stands now, there are definitely pluses and minuses to both. My answer would basically be, if you can get it, I would lean towards the Founders Edition GPU. I think the design is so awesome that I can't wait to get my hands on one. Design looks really cool. I've always loved the Founders Edition GPUs anyway. Even when people were hating on the 1080 Ti and the blower style cooler, I always kind of enjoyed that, especially in smaller cases. So I'm actually pretty excited for the Founders Edition GPU. It's a lot different than anything we've had before. But having said that, some of these third-party GPUs are also looking pretty awesome. But for now, I'm definitely sold on this Founders Edition. I think it's very iconic looking, and I think when we look back at it in 10 years and we look at this generation, instead of showing you a third-party cooler, probably you'll see this very iconic Founders Edition. So that's one of the reasons that I'm going for it. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the information. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.